Luke 4:16 through 21. He went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, and was his custom. And he stood up to read. The scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found a place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to release the oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him, and he began by saying to them, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing."
I want to thank Robin for being such a willing participant in helping me to read that scripture before my lessons. He always hops up there and volunteers, and I appreciate that attitude. It's been an active week at the Tripp house today. This week we've had family in for a visit. In fact, my mother-in-law, Mary Ann Baston, is with us this morning, and we enjoy having her in and glad she could visit with us today. You won't have a hard time finding which one she is. If you've seen Lenore, you'll know her very, very well. And Anna's in for a visit as well, and we're thankful to have her with us this weekend. We've been going through a sermon series, like Josh said earlier, through the book of Luke. And in the book of Luke, we're working from the end of the book to the beginning of the book. So we're working backwards, and we're working to look at purpose. Why did Luke write what he wrote? Why did he choose the narratives and the teachings of Jesus that he chose? What was he hoping to accomplish by that? And what did he want to show us about Jesus? I believe the gospel writers were intentional in what they wrote and in why they wrote it. And as we read what they wrote, we begin to see that story unfold, their perspective of this Messiah, of Jesus, of what it was all about and what he was all about. And so we're asking the question in our lesson series, why Jesus? And again, the question is intended for us to think in terms of why should we be worshiping Jesus? Why should we choose Jesus over all others? As Luke asked those in his culture to believe and trust in Jesus beyond and above all others and to the exclusion of all others. And I'm sure his culture would have asked, and maybe the person that he wrote to, this mysterious Theophilus, would have asked, why should I believe in Jesus? We've got all these other gods, all these other options out there, all these other claims to be gods. Why Jesus? And why to the exclusion of all others? And I believe Luke very much was addressing those kinds of questions as he writes his gospel. It's a question that's relevant in our culture today too. With all the other belief structures out there, and now they're saying that the most choice-worthy option out there is to believe nothing. It's just to not have a religion, not have a belief, and just kind of do it your way. Do it the way you want to do it. And so our culture is asking us too, why Jesus? And they're asking for our answers. And hopefully, through this lesson series, we'll be able to give an answer to those who may ask why we have the faith that we do in Jesus. Last week, Neil addressed Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. And I believe his answer to the question, why Jesus, why Luke may have put that in there, was because Jesus came humbly. He came on a donkey. He wasn't one who came as a king. He didn't come commanding. He came showing us how he wanted us to live. Today we're going to look at some of the teachings of Jesus, a couple of his parables, a couple of his stories, and look at how he dealt with those who were considered to be the underclass of his day. And our answer to the question this morning of why Jesus is because he was a champion of the underclass. Have you ever been misquoted? Have you ever had a time when you've said something or made a comment on something, you've spoken, given opinion in some way, shape, or form, and you've turned around and had someone come to you and say, hey, I heard you said this. And you said, well, no, I didn't say that. I may have said something like that, but I didn't say that. One time I was asked for an opinion on something or to give a statement about something that was going on in our community involving one of the members of the church that I was working with at the time. Asked me to have a comment on it, and I said something, and it was a print article that this reporter wrote in, and they quoted me, but the quote really wasn't, it was something that I had said, but it was trimmed and lifted out of its context and made to conform to what the reporter wanted it to say. Really didn't end up being what I said, although the words I had said, the words that he quoted there, but the way he made it look something totally different than what I intended. You feel kind of helpless when you're misquoted. Like it's out there, but you really don't have much to say about it. Like it's something that you can't draw back, and yet misquotes are something that take place. And sometimes we have to put up with that. It's something that takes place on social media pretty often. You see that kind of thing take place. Have you seen I'm on Facebook, I guess. I don't do a lot of the others, but a lot of times on Facebook, you'll see someone takes a picture of someone who's famous, or a historical figure, or a political figure, and they'll have a quote beside this person as if that's something that they've said. But when you look at it, you think, I'm not sure they said that. Like this one. Well, it's obvious that Abraham Lincoln wasn't around when the internet was invented, right? And so it's pretty obvious that though that statement is attributed to him, and I'm sure there's a lot of tongue-in-cheek on that one, it's attributed to him, but obviously he didn't say it. I can do it too. I came up with this one. With, imagine a world where all God's creatures can live together without fear of being eaten by one another. That's something that may have been said out there, but I'm pretty sure he didn't say that, right? If you know Phil Robertson, he's a member of PETA, but it stands for People Eating Tasty Animals, right? That's kind of where he comes from. And it's kind of the way he does things. I mean, it's kind of fun to do it once in a while. I mean, you can just attribute anything to anyone. You could attribute that to Zach, but I'm pretty sure he didn't say that. I think he's kind of a fan of facial hair. But when you look at statements that are attributed to Jesus sometimes, and I don't know, I've never really seen this take place, but I've seen people quote this as if it has some religious significance. But I guarantee you, and I think we can show from our text today, Jesus wouldn't have said something like this. That wouldn't be his perspective on the poor. We see that said, it's out there. We see a lot of people putting that out there, but it's not something that he would have said because it's not something that he would have believed. He had a special place in his heart for the underclass. He had a special place in his heart for those who were treated differently or treated badly. And Luke points that out. He points out the view that Jesus had to the poor, to the weak, to those who were sick, to those who were homeless, to widows, to orphans. He had a special place in his heart for them because his words reflect it. And we're going to look at some of those words this morning. The reading that was read for us earlier by Robin, Jesus points out early in Luke, and Luke includes it in his writings, about Jesus reading from the prophet Isaiah, reading from a section of Isaiah where he's speaking about the redeeming of Israel. After Israel's put into exile and after they go through what they have to go through, Isaiah tells them there's going to come a time, though, that you'll be brought back and things will start to improve. Your lives will be better again and you'll have the things that you once had. And as Jesus reads this idea about this, he says, the Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to proclaim the good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and the recovery of sight for the blind, and to set the oppressed free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Then he rolled the scroll up in a moment that would have been really interesting to see. As you think about Jesus, he's in his hometown in this situation, rolls the scroll up. People knew him, they knew his family. He rolls it up, hands it off to the attendant, and as he's sitting down, he says, oh, by the way, that's talking about me. I got to think you've heard some silence in that room, right? As they thought, whoa, did you just say Isaiah was talking about you in that passage? We know your brothers and sisters. We know your parents. Come on, you've got to be kidding. And that's soon after that is where Jesus utters, no prophet is without honor except in his own hometown. And we know what took place after that. But Luke includes this, I think, intentionally. And he sets up, because several passages from the passage where this was read in Luke chapter 4 to where we are today talks about Jesus' attitude towards the poor, towards the underclass, towards the underprivileged, to those who are oppressed, to those who are sick, and to those who are needy. And in Luke chapter 18, he tells us a couple of stories, and he describes an interaction that Jesus had. And in that, again, it shows his heart for these people. As we read through these stories, I want you to take note of something. Who are the protagonists in these stories? Who are the heroes of Jesus' stories? Who are the ones that as he tells these stories, he makes to look good? He makes to look to be positive, to the happy side of the story, versus those he claims to be the villains, or claims to be those who are living less than they should be. Starting in verse 1 of Luke 18, he says, "Then Jesus told his disciples a parable to show them that they should always pray and not give up. In a certain town there was a judge who neither feared God nor cared for what people thought. And there was a widow in that town who kept coming to him with a plea, 'Grant me justice against my adversary.' And for some time he refused. But finally he said to himself, 'Even though I don't fear God or care what people think, yet because this widow keeps on bothering me, I will see that she gets some justice, so that she won't eventually come and attack me.' And the Lord said, 'Listen to what the unjust judge says, and will not God bring about justice for his chosen ones, who cry out to him day and night? Will he keep putting them off? I tell you that he will see that they get justice, and quickly. However, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth?'" So we have a persistent widow as the protagonist of this story. You've heard how widows were treated back then, what their lot was. Being a widow, obviously they lose their main source of support, being their husband. And if they don't have sons and family that are willing to take care of them, a lot of them were the poorest of the poor in that situation. They were the easiest to kick to the curb, the easiest to count out and to count as not a part of the society. And so when she comes to this judge who really didn't care about anybody, you would think the least that he would care about would be this widow. And yet when she continually bothers him, the judge finally grants her request. God says, don't you think, or Jesus says, don't you think that God, being who he is, will grant your request as you consistently and persistently pray? And I think it's interesting at the end when he says, "But will the Son of Man, when he returns, find faith on this earth?" Think about that. We're going to come back to it. Next passage. Again, think about who the protagonist of this story is, and the antagonist also. Verse 9, "To some who were confident of their own righteousness, he looked down on everyone else. He told this parable. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, 'God, thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give 1/10 of all I get.' But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but he beat his breast and said, 'God, have mercy on me, a sinner.' I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted." Again, the protagonist in the story, the tax collector in this situation, right? And we know the status of the tax collectors. They weren't among the poor, but they were certainly the underclass among the Jewish people. They were hated. They were outcast. They were considered to be the worst of the sinners, the lowest of the low among the Jewish people. And yet again, Jesus chooses him to be the protagonist. The antagonist is what? The religious expert, right? The guy who's considered to be the expert of the law, the teacher of Israel, the Pharisee. And yet Jesus says, because he exalted himself, he's going to be humbled at some point in time. And then his exchange, verse 15. People were also bringing babies to Jesus for him to place his hands on them. But the disciples rebuked them. But Jesus called the children to him and said, "Let the little children come to me and do not hinder them. For the kingdom of God belongs to such as these. For truly I tell you, anyone who will not receive the kingdom of God like a little child will never enter it." Again, those children were being raised in a society where children were seen and not heard, right? It was mom's primary job to raise them. Dad's primary job was to teach them and to discipline them. That was kind of the way their society was ordered and structured. And children were valued most when they might be present, but they're going to be quiet. You're not going to hear them, and you're not going to see them. And so when they were coming to the teacher to have him place his hands on them and to bless them, his disciples were saying, no, you're not important enough to be seeing Jesus at this point in time. And Jesus said, wait a minute. They're important. In fact, if you don't come to me like one of these, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. We have in this story persistent, disciplined prayer. We have a humble perspective. We have a childlike openness to the kingdom that Jesus calls out and spotlights. And when he calls those attitudes out and spotlights, he attributes them to the meekest, to the lowest, to the most outcast among them. It's an important point, not only in Luke's writing, but the gospel writings, because it's a clear point. It's a point that they don't want us to miss. It's a point that shows Jesus, God in the flesh, when he comes to earth in a very humble way, as Neil pointed out last week. As he comes to earth, he doesn't hobnob with the rich and the famous. He doesn't try to become a king who lives in palaces. He doesn't try to be this political figure that everyone looks up to. And he doesn't hang around with people who can only help him. Jesus was a champion of the underclass. He was one who cared for them and who demonstrated his care in many ways. He spent a great deal of his time with them. When Jesus was on the earth, he almost seemed to prefer their company rather than to mix with those who were important or self-important. Jesus would much rather hang out with the tax collectors and the sinners than he would the Pharisees. They were drawn to him. We see especially in the area around Galilee when he would be in that area that crowds were drawn to him. We know and understand that was an area where poverty was even more rampant than in other areas of the kingdom. And yet that's where Jesus found himself, and that's where he went. Jesus more than just met their needs, he took time to understand their plight. And that's different than what the Pharisees did. The Pharisees maintained that, well, if they would just live their lives right, God would bless them too. The Pharisees made every excuse they could to kick him to the curb and to pass him by. It's kind of like saying, well, they wouldn't be poor if they'd just get a job. That's not something Jesus would have said. His love for them was special. And here's an important point. If you don't get anything else, I want you to get this. His attention to them was special. His heart held them as special. He worked among them, he healed them, and he helped them. And yet most all of them, remained poor. They remained in their condition and their station of life. We don't have one example of someone who was poor that Jesus gave a lot of money to and helped them to become rich. Not one example of that. And so why would Jesus, I think we could all rationally say that he had the power it was within his power to relieve their circumstances, right? He could have in an instant given them a lot of power. He could have given them a lot of money. He could have given them land or resources. He could have relieved their situation. He could have made the poor wealthy. But he never did that. That wasn't what he was about. He wasn't there to fix the poor. In fact, he said, you'll always have the poor among you. The rich young ruler in a passage just after this one comes to him and says, how do I get eternal life? And Jesus quotes some of the 10 Commandments, and he says, oh, I've always done that. So he said, well, if you want to be perfect, go and sell everything you have, give it to the poor, and then come and follow me. Jesus' admonition to him was not about helping the poor. Even if this man had given everything to the poor, there still would have been poor people. His admonition to this man was making him poor, because out of poverty, he might find great wealth. Their circumstances, the circumstances of the poor and the circumstances of the needy, are fertile ground to grow a great treasure. When someone is poor, when they approach life with a total dependence on God, there's something that happens within them that helps them to be the kind of followers that God desperately wants. It grows a quality of faith within their life that they need, that in their need, that allows them to be the kind of people that God wants them to be. Their poverty is this soil. And it's clear in this situation, in Jesus' stories, that he sees these people, these poor people, this underclass, the underprivileged, as his heroes, his protagonists. Their faith, and not the faith of the Pharisees, Jesus believes, is what pushes the kingdom forward. And so when Jesus wades in among them, and he teaches them, and he talks to them, he doesn't give them financial counseling. He doesn't teach them how, well, if you just do this differently, your situation in life will improve. Instead, he turns their situation and says, I want you to take your need and cast it upon God. In your poverty, cry out to him. Continually pray to him. Don't you see that he sees you, that he cares for you, that he'll deliver you? And it's that total dependence on God that God finds so pleasing, finds so rewarding, finds awesome. One of the times I visited Haiti, a man came to me in one of the outlying neighborhoods or villages that we were visiting, and in the big city of Port-au-Prince, the poverty was horrible. But in the outlying areas and the rural communities, it was even worse. I mean, the people there lived in the ways that people in our country would have lived in the 1700s. I mean, that's the kind of resources that they had. It's the way that they lived their lives. And they were desperately living in poverty. And I remember a man coming to me and asking if we had any food that we could give him for his family. I mean, you could tell from the way he was dressed and from the way he presented himself that his request was genuine. And it wasn't what we were doing. We weren't handing out food while we were out there. We were actually at this time I was on a medical mission, and so we were providing medical care for young people and some adults. And I said, through a translator, sir, I'm so sorry. We don't have anything with us right now to give you. And he said, that's all right. He said, through a translator, every day when I get up, I don't have food. I don't have food for me. I don't have food for my family. And I never know where it's come from and where it's going to come from. But every day, I find that God provides. Wow. That statement, I mean, it betrays a kind of faith that we just can't relate to, right? We can't relate to getting up and opening our refrigerator and having nothing there, to opening the cabinets and seeing nothing. And yet that's what this man claims that he did every day. And yet he depended on God, and he knew somehow, some way, that God was going to come through, and he was going to meet their needs. There's something to that. There's something that Jesus leads us to. There's something that he wants us to see in that kind of faith. And it's that kind of faith that he wants us to seek. That total dependence on God. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, in his book, Cost of Discipleship, we've been studying it on Wednesday night, talks about or describes this kind of life that's living without a safety net. It's this total dependence on God, that it's all on him and none on me. Living my life in complete faith that God walks with me each and every moment, and that I can't save myself. I can't feed myself. I can't meet my needs. I have to depend on him to do it. It's that kind of life that produces this kind of faith. The pictures in the slides that I had before this they were pictures that came from Haiti. They weren't pictures that I've taken. I collected them from others. But they accurately described what I saw when I was down there, the kind of poverty that the children live in, the kind of clothes that they wear, what you often see in their lives and in what they are. And I can't speak of God's heroes without telling you a little bit about Roberta Edwards. She's the lady that's in the picture there. I met her a couple of times when I went down to Haiti to do the medical mission trips or some of the other things that we did, and knew of her work at that point in time. She moved to Haiti with her husband back in I believe it's the early 90s, may have been the late 80s, I'm not sure exactly when, but that kind of time frame, with the idea of working in an orphanage or even beginning an orphanage to help the thousands and thousands of orphan children that were needed taken care of in Haiti. She went down there. Her husband was a Haitian national. He was from there. And so she moved down there with him, but not long after they got set up and established in this place, her husband left. I don't know why he left. I don't know where he went. I don't know what the issues were there, but I know that she was left alone. And she had an opportunity at that point in time, well, really at any point in time, because she was a U.S. citizen. She could have moved back to the United States at any point in time and carried on her life here and pursued whatever she needed to pursue here. But she felt very specifically that God had called her to work with the children in Haiti. And so she continued her work there. And for years and years and years, she helped to run this orphanage in Haiti. She would take in kids that had no homes or whose parents were just too poor to care for them. And she would care for them, she would teach them, she would give them an education, she would help them to learn a trade, and then she would send them out into their community, where often they did very, very well. I worked with a couple of her children, the children that she had raised in that children's home in the mission trips that I was on down there. They served as translators for us. And they wouldn't have known, they had no way of knowing English except that she taught it to them, because it was a skill that would come in very handy in their country and in any line of work that they might be in. And that's the kind of person that she was. Again and again and again, there are many, many children, many, many adults now who can tell the story of what Roberta meant to their life. You may have read the article in the paper or the Christian Chronicle or something along those lines. Just this past week, Roberta had gotten gas at a gas station and was pulling out of a gas station. She was in the capital city of Port-au-Prince, and a car pulled in front of her. And two men got out of the car carrying guns. And they blocked her way, and they began to fire into the car. And the bullets struck her and killed her. And they went and took a young boy that she had been caring for out of the car and took the young boy with them. We still don't know why. We still don't know what they want to do with this young boy, if he belonged to one of them or if they're going to try to ask for a ransom for him. We don't know what's going on there. But we do know that for Roberta, her time on earth here is done. That her life now stands as an icon of the kind of faith that we're talking about. The kind of faith that says, I'll choose to be poor and to let God use me in my poverty. To use the kind of faith that grows rich out of poverty to show others how to live their lives. This is one of those circumstances where sometimes you ask of God, God, she was there to serve you. How could you allow that to be? I don't know all the answers to that one. I don't know why God allows these tragedies to happen to people who are so obviously and incredibly dedicated to His work. But that's what happened in this case. But I know we can take so many rich lessons out of her life. I know that we can see in her the kind of woman the kind of characteristics that we need to have. The kind of faith that says riches and stuff and material is so unimportant in relationship to how we need to bring God's gift to the world. The message of Jesus, because that's something that she brought to all of her kids too, that stayed with her. They all knew about Jesus, and they all learned to love Him through her love for Him. We can learn from her life. We can learn to have that kind of faith. We can learn that not only does God call us to be people who help the poor, and let's be clear, as we close this lesson, let's be clear that there's no one who can call him or herself a disciple of Jesus who ignores or eschews or puts off our responsibility to help those who are underprivileged. There's no way that you can call yourself a follower of Jesus and not have a heart for those who are less fortunate. It's simply a part of who we are and what we are if we're to be the hands and the feet of Jesus in this world. But it goes further than that. Because God sees that kind of faith that grows in poverty. He not only calls us to help those who are poor, but He calls us to actually become those who are poor. He calls us to sell all that we have and give it to the poor and come and follow Him. And I'm not one of those who say that we have to do that literally, but I'll say that some of us may need to. We certainly need to have the attitude that all we have does not belong to us. It belongs to Him. And it's for His glory. And if it can't be used for His glory, it's got to go. Right? Because if it's for me and for my pleasure and for what I want only, then it's not for His glory. It's got to go. He calls us to be poor. He calls us to live life without a safety net. He calls us to live faith that's extraordinary. A faith that comes from total dependence on God. A faith that can face each day, like the man I told you about, knowing I don't have, but God will provide. And we're encouraged to live life in that way as well. God's here with us this morning, and He sees and knows your needs and knows your heart. His heart aches for your poverty in whatever form that might take, just like it does for those that we see Him help. And if there's some way that we as a church can help you in what you're going through today or in your life right now, we want to be there for you. We want to help you with that as we work together to determine what this poverty of life is for us. We want to work with you to help you with that. We're going to have people stationed around the auditorium. Some of our leaders will be there, and they want to pray with you. If you have a need this morning, they can make it private or we can announce it publicly, either way. Lenore, my wife, is going to be standing in the lobby, and we may have some other ladies who are wives of leaders in this congregation or leaders themselves to stand out there and to pray with women who would rather pray with women. That's what that's for. If this morning you're not a Christian and you want to follow, you've been asking why Jesus, and you know that the reason we've talked about this morning is because He has a heart for the underclass. He has a heart for those who are less fortunate. And if that compels you to become more and more like Him, then your first step is an easy one. It's to say that you believe that Jesus is the Son of God. It's to be buried with Him in baptism and rise walking a new life and begin to develop this kind of faith as you live your life and your walk with Him. And if we can help you with that this morning, we would love to do that. You'll need to come forward and let one of us know, and we'll take care of that this very morning. Whatever your need might be, we ask that you come and take this opportunity as we stand and sing.